The Old Testament is a book that focuses upon the land. There aren't many boat stories or fish stories within the Old Testament. Yet when we get to the New Testament, it's as if we've arrived, as James Jordan talks about, in Fish City. There are fish everywhere. We hear stories of fishermen being called, leaving their nets behind and being told that they will become fishers of men. We read of stories of shipwrecks. We read of stories of great catches of fish and eating fish. The story of the multiplication of the fish and the loaves. In all of the Gospels, they record this event. And throughout the Gospels and the book of Acts, we hear of seas, stories that focus not just upon the land and shepherds and sheep and goats and oxen and asses, but of fish. Now, as we go through the Old Testament, where do we find stories of the sea? Where do we find stories of fish? Not in many places, but in a few locations we find stories of this kind. We find stories of that kind in the story of the flood and in the story particularly of Jonah. And these stories are both connected with each other. And we could develop that at some length, but what I want to focus upon here is the story of Jonah in particular. Jonah is swallowed by a big fish. And that story is a story of Jonah being sent to the land of Assyria and to the city of Nineveh. The big fish, as we read the story of Jonah, can be seen to be connected with Nineveh itself. He is a disobedient prophet who represents an unfaithful nation of Israel in its prophetic mission to the nations. The unfaithful prophet who seeks to escape from his vocation is plunged into the sea and swallowed by a big fish that God has prepared for the purpose. And that big fish later disgorges him on land, and he ends up going out on his mission again. As we read through that story, we should see that it is a story of the prophet himself, but it's also a story that speaks of Israel's fate. Israel will be thrown into the sea of the Gentiles. Israel will be swallowed up by a big fish. And that big fish is Assyria itself. As Israel is swallowed by that big fish, they will find out that God has prepared that big fish for that very purpose. God is sovereign in the dealings of the nations. If you read in the story of Habakkuk, God speaks about the fish as those that have no ruler over them. They're caught in nets. Like the birds of the air, the fish operate in a way that shows no leadership. The fish are not part of the domestic animals that you have in the story of Israel. Rather, they belong to that wild, untamed realm of the sea. Throughout the Old Testament and into the New, I think they are associated with the Gentiles. The Gentiles dwell in the realm of the sea, and they are caught, and then they are brought in. We see stories in the New Testament that play upon this theme. That as Israel is sent out to the nations, they are being sent out upon the sea. Like Jonah, they are being sent out, and they're dealing with these sea beasts, these sea monsters. The book of Ezekiel compares Pharaoh in the Nile to a sea monster. We see the same thing elsewhere in Scripture, where the great sea beasts arise from the sea of the Gentiles, and they threaten the land. Israel is sent out upon the seas. The church is a boat, and it's sent out to fish men, to fish from the lands of the Gentiles, and to bring in a great dragnet, this harvest of the seas.